The night she was born, the sky was darker than anyone in the small Nigerian village of Akodo had ever seen. The moon, usually a radiant beacon above the tall palm trees, was obscured by a thick veil of clouds. The village elders huddled around a dimly lit hut where screams pierced the silence, accompanied by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the thatched roof. It was a storm unlike any other, as if the heavens themselves were mourning. Inside the hut, Amara struggled for her life and that of her unborn child. The midwife, an elderly woman named Mama Nkechi, barked orders to her assistants, her hands moving with the expertise of someone who had delivered hundreds of babies. But this was no ordinary birth. Amara's cries grew weaker, and Mama Nkechi's face was etched with worry. "She's losing too much blood," she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling for the first time in years. At last, the baby's wail broke through the storm, a sound so sharp and pure it seemed to command the rain to stop. The villagers waiting outside gasped as the downpour eased to a gentle drizzle. Mama Nkechi held the baby girl up to the dim lantern light, her dark skin glistening with the effort of her entrance into the world. But her triumph was short-lived. Amara lay motionless, her chest rising no more. "Amara is gone," Mama Nkechi whispered, her voice heavy with sorrow. The news spread like wildfire through the village, and soon whispers filled the air. "The child is cursed," some said. "Her birth brought death to her mother." Others looked upon the baby with pity, wondering what fate awaited her in a world that had already turned its back. The child was named Adanna, meaning daughter of her father, but her father, Chike, was nowhere to be found. Overcome with grief and anger, he had left the village moments after learning of Amara's death. Some said he had gone mad, unable to face the responsibility of raising a child who had come into the world under such tragic circumstances. Without a father's protection and a mother's love, Adanna became a ward of the village, though not in the way most orphans were. People avoided her, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and guilt. She was fed scraps and left to sleep wherever she could find shelter. Her cries in the night echoed through the village, a haunting reminder of the life that had been lost to bring her into existence. Despite the odds, Adanna survived. Even as a newborn, there was a resilience about her that Mama Nkechi couldn't ignore. The old woman took it upon herself to ensure the baby had what she needed to live, though even she couldn't protect Adanna from the whispers and superstitions that plagued her existence. "Mama Nkechi, why do you bother with her?" a younger woman asked one day as the midwife prepared a bowl of mashed yams for the baby. "You know she'll bring nothing but misfortune." Mama Nkechi's eyes blazed. "Misfortune? She is just a child. The only misfortune here is the way we treat her." But even her defense couldn't silence the murmurs that followed Adanna wherever she went. One night, as the village slept, Mama Nkechi carried Adanna to the edge of the burial grounds where Amara had been laid to rest. She placed the child gently on a small woven mat next to the grave, and whispered, "Your mother's spirit will watch over you. Little one, sleep here, where you will be safe." From that night on, Adanna's home was her mother's grave. It was a place of peace amid the chaos of her young life. As the years passed, she would grow to find comfort in the soft hum of the wind through the trees and the faint glow of fireflies dancing above the earth that cradled her mother. Little did she know, this grave would become the starting point of a journey that would shake the foundations of Akodo and reveal truths long buried. The morning sun cast long shadows over the burial grounds, its golden rays gently illuminating the makeshift mat where Adanna lay. At just 5 years old, her connection to the grave was unshakable. She would wake each morning to the sound of birds chirping and the rustle of leaves, as if the land itself was whispering secrets only she could understand. Her small, dark eyes often stared at the mound of earth that marked her mother's resting place, her tiny hands tracing patterns in the soil. The villagers continued to avoid her, their glances filled with unease. To them, Adanna's presence at the graveyard was an eerie testament to the tragedy that marked her birth. Children her age were forbidden to play near her, and adults only approached when necessary. The whispers followed her wherever she went. "That's the cursed child," they'd say. "She'll bring ruin to anyone who befriends her." Despite their ostracism, Adanna found solace in the solitude of the burial grounds. The grave became her sanctuary, a place where she felt her mother's spirit linger. Mama Nkeche visited her often, bringing food and stories to keep her company. "Your mother was the bravest woman I knew," Mama Nkeche would say, her voice filled with reverence. "She gave her life so you could have yours. You must honor her strength by being strong too." Adanna clung to those words, letting them form the foundation of her young identity. She spent her days exploring the area around the grave, discovering small treasures like shiny stones and colorful feathers. She imagined they were gifts from her mother, tokens of love from the afterlife. At night, she would lie under the stars, her mother's grave a silent guardian, and dream of a life where she was no longer alone. But the village's resentment towards her didn't waver. One fateful day, a group of children dared each other to approach her. Led by Adanna, a boy known for his mischief, they tiptoed to the edge of the burial grounds. "Let's see if the cursed child will hex us," Adanna sneered, his voice loud enough for Adanna to hear. She turned to face them, her gaze steady and unafraid. "I'm not cursed," she said firmly. "This is my home, and you have no right to disturb it." Her calm demeanor unsettled the group, and one by one, they backed away. Only Adanna remained, his bravado fading as Adanna took a step toward him. "Go home," she said softly, but with authority that belied her age. He ran, leaving Adanna alone once more. Though she had won this small victory, she couldn't ignore the loneliness that weighed heavily on her heart. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Adanna knelt by her mother's grave. "Mama," she whispered, "why did you leave me? Why won't they accept me?" The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around her. Adanna closed her eyes, imagining it was her mother's touch. Though she had no answers, she felt a renewed determination. She would prove to the villagers that she was not a curse but a blessing. Her journey was just beginning, and she would face it with the courage her mother had passed down to her. From the moment she could walk and speak, Adanna understood that she was different. The whispers followed her wherever she went, shadowing her every move. The villagers' voices became a chorus of fear and suspicion that seemed to grow louder with each passing year. "She's cursed," they would mutter. "Nothing good will come of her." The burial grounds where Adanna lived became a metaphor for her isolation. To the villagers, it was a place of finality and fear, but to Adanna, it was home. She learned to read the patterns of the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the soft hum of insects as if they were her companions. The natural world became her refuge, offering her lessons in resilience and survival. One day, as Adanna roamed the outskirts of the village, she overheard a group of women talking near the marketplace. They spoke in hushed tones, but the intensity of their words carried through the air. "Do you see how the crops have failed again this season?" one of them said, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's her, that girl, ever since she was born, nothing has been the same." Another woman nodded in agreement. "Even the river runs drier these days, it's a bad omen." Adanna froze, clutching a small basket of wild fruits she had gathered. Their words stung, but she refused to cry. Instead, she squared her shoulders and stepped forward. "The river runs dry because of the sun," she said, her voice steady. "The crops fail because they lack water. Blaming me will not change that." The women gasped, startled by her boldness. For a moment, silence hung between them, but then one of them scoffed. "The child speaks like she knows better than her elders, typical of a cursed one." Adanna didn't respond. She turned and walked away, her head held high. But deep down, their words left a mark. She returned to the burial grounds and sat by her mother's grave, seeking solace. "Mama," she whispered, "how can I show them I'm not what they think I am?" As if in response, a gentle breeze rustled the trees around her. Adanna took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. She resolved to prove herself, not through words, but through actions. If the villagers saw her strength and kindness, perhaps they would change their minds. The next day, Adanna set out to help where she could. She gathered water from the river for the elderly, carried firewood for those in need, and even tended to small gardens in the village. Some villagers accepted her help reluctantly, while others outright refused, muttering curses under their breath. Still, Adanna persisted, her determination unwavering. One evening, as she returned to the burial grounds, she noticed a young boy crying near the edge of the forest. He was Adanna's younger brother, Chitty. His leg was caught in a crude trap meant for small animals. Adanna rushed to his side, ignoring the boy's frightened protests. "Be still," she said gently, working to free him from the trap. Once his leg was free, she tore a piece of cloth from her dress to bandage his wound. "You'll be fine," she assured him. "But you must be more careful." Chitty looked at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice trembling. When Adanna helped him back to the village, the sight of her carrying Chitty caused a stir. Adanna, who had once mocked her, rushed forward and pulled his brother away. "What did you do to him?" he demanded, his eyes blazing with suspicion. "I helped him," Adanna replied calmly. "His leg was caught in a trap." But Adanna wasn't convinced. "Stay away from my family," he warned before leading Chitty away. Despite her good deed, Adanna's efforts to bridge the gap between herself and the villagers seemed futile. Yet as she lay down that night beside her mother's grave, she felt a glimmer of hope. Chitty had thanked her. Perhaps not all was lost. Adanna knew her journey was far from over, but she was determined to keep fighting for a place in the world that had rejected her from the start. The burial grounds were eerily quiet one evening as Adanna prepared to settle in for the night. The air was thick with humidity, and the usual sounds of crickets seemed distant, almost muffled. Adanna sat cross-legged by her mother's grave, humming softly to herself, when a faint rustle in the distance caught her attention. She looked up, her sharp eyes scanning the tree line. It was rare for anyone to venture near the burial grounds at night. Most villagers feared the place, believing it was haunted by restless spirits. But Adanna felt no fear. This was her home, her sanctuary. Still, she couldn't ignore the unease creeping up her spine. Rising to her feet, she called out, "Who's there?" There was no response, only the whisper of the wind through the trees. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Adanna, holding a crude torch in one hand and a wooden club in the other. Behind him were two other boys, their faces barely visible in the flickering light. Adanna's heart sank. She recognized the look in their eyes, a mix of bravado and fear. They were here to prove something, perhaps to themselves or the village. Adanna stepped forward, his torch casting long shadows across the graves. "Cursed girl," he spat, his voice trembling slightly. "We're not afraid of you." Adanna held her ground, her gaze steady. "You should leave, this is not a place for games." Adanna laughed, though the sound lacked conviction. "We're here to show everyone that you're just a scared little girl, hiding behind ghosts." Adanna took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I'm not afraid," she said firmly. "But you should be. Disrespecting the dead is never wise." Her words seemed to unsettle the boys, but Adanna pressed on. He swung his club at a nearby tree, splintering the bark. "See? Nothing happens." The burial grounds were eerily quiet one evening as Adanna prepared to settle in for the night. The air was thick with humidity, and the usual sounds of crickets seemed distant, almost muffled. Adanna sat cross-legged by her mother's grave, humming softly to herself, when a faint rustle in the distance caught her attention. She looked up, her sharp eyes scanning the tree line. It was rare for anyone to venture near the burial grounds at night. Most villagers feared the place, believing it was haunted by restless spirits. But Adanna felt no fear. This was her home, her sanctuary. Still, she couldn't ignore the unease creeping up her spine. Rising to her feet, she called out, "Who's there?" There was no response, only the whisper of the wind through the trees. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Adanna, holding a crude torch in one hand and a wooden club in the other. Behind him were two other boys, their faces barely visible in the flickering light. Adanna's heart sank. She recognized the look in their eyes, a mix of bravado and fear. They were here to prove something, perhaps to themselves or the village. Adanna stepped forward, his torch casting long shadows across the graves. "Cursed girl," he spat, his voice trembling slightly. "We're not afraid of you." Adanna held her ground, her gaze steady. "You should leave, this is not a place for games." Adanna laughed, though the sound lacked conviction. "We're here to show everyone that you're just a scared little girl, hiding behind ghosts." Adanna took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I'm not afraid," she said firmly. "But you should be. Disrespecting the dead is never wise." Her words seemed to unsettle the boys, but Adanna pressed on. He swung his club at a nearby tree, splintering the bark. "See, nothing happens." A chill wind swept through the burial grounds, extinguishing his torch. The sudden darkness was oppressive, and the boys huddled closer together. Adanna felt it too, a shift in the air, as though the graves themselves were holding their breath. She whispered a silent prayer to the spirits. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, like leaves brushing against each other. They grew louder, more distinct. Words, unintelligible but undeniably human, seemed to echo from all directions. The boys' bravado crumbled. "What is that?" one of them stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Adanna stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Leave now, and perhaps they will forgive your intrusion." Adanna's hands trembled, his grip on the club faltering. But he stood his ground, his pride warring with his fear. "It's just a trick," he said, though his voice wavered. "She's trying to scare us." Before anyone could respond, a low moan rose from the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't human, nor was it entirely of this world. The boys froze, their faces pale. Adanna's heart raced, but she refused to show fear. This was her home, and she trusted the spirits to protect her. The moaning grew louder, and the earth beneath Adanna's feet seemed to shift. He stumbled back, his bravado finally crumbling. "Let's go," he shouted, pushing past his companions. They didn't need to be told twice. The boys ran, their panicked footsteps fading into the distance. Adanna stood alone once more, the whispers fading into silence. She knelt by her mother's grave, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't know what the spirits had done, but she was grateful. The burial grounds were quiet again, but the unease lingered. Adanna knew this wasn't the end. The boys' intrusion had stirred something, and she could only hope the spirits' anger would not extend beyond the graveyard. The morning sun rose timidly, its golden rays struggling to pierce through the thick mist that clung to the burial grounds. Adanna's sleep had been fitful, haunted by strange dreams of shadowy figures and whispered warnings. She sat by her mother's grave, her fingers tracing the carved symbols on the headstone. The air felt heavy, and the tranquility of the morning did little to ease her growing unease. By midday, the village was abuzz with whispers about the previous night. Adanna and his friends had returned home pale and shaken, muttering incoherent stories about the burial grounds. Word spread quickly, and soon the villagers' fearful glances turned toward Adanna. She was used to their mistrust. Ever since she had taken up residence in the burial grounds after her mother's death, rumors had swirled about her being cursed or in league with spirits. Adanna had learned to live with the isolation, finding solace in the quiet company of the graves. But today, the whispers felt heavier, laced with a new kind of fear. "Adanna," a familiar voice called out. She turned to see Kelechi, one of the few villagers who still spoke to her. His expression was grave as he approached, his broad frame tense with unease. "What happened last night? The boys, they say the spirits came alive." Adanna's gaze was steady. "They disrespected the dead," she said simply. "The spirits do not take kindly to that." Kelechi's brows knitted together. "The villagers are scared, they think you brought a curse upon us." Adanna's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask them to come, they brought this upon themselves." Kelechi sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Even so, they're talking about going to the chief, they want him to banish you." Adanna's heart sank, though she kept her expression calm. "Let them do what they must, I'll face whatever comes." Kelechi hesitated, then reached into his satchel and pulled out a small talisman made of carved wood and twine. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hand. "It's for protection, whatever is stirring in the burial grounds, it's not just the spirits of the dead." Adanna frowned, her fingers closing around the talisman. "What do you mean?" Kelechi glanced over his shoulder, as if afraid of being overheard. "There are old stories, older than the village itself, of something buried here long ago, something that should never be disturbed." A chill ran down Adanna's spine. "What kind of something?" Kelechi shook his head. "I don't know, but if the spirits are restless, it might be because whatever lies beneath is waking up." Adanna stared at him, her mind racing. The burial grounds had always felt alive to her, but this was different. If what Kelechi said was true, the boy's intrusion might have done more than anger the spirits. It might have awakened something far older and far more dangerous. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Adanna tightened her grip on the talisman. The villagers' fear was nothing compared to the dread creeping into her heart. She knew she had to uncover the truth about the burial grounds before it was too late. Night fell over the village, and with it came an unnatural stillness. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and a deep chill settled in despite the season. Adanna sat by her small fire, her mind racing with Kelechi's cryptic warning. The talisman lay in her lap, its carved symbols glowing faintly in the firelight. She traced them with her fingers, trying to decipher their meaning. The burial grounds had always been a place of peace for her, but now it felt as though the very soil was shifting, restless. She could feel it beneath her feet, a hum, almost imperceptible, but growing stronger. Whatever lay beneath was waking, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. As the fire crackled, a low sound drifted through the air. It was faint at first, like a distant drumbeat, but it grew louder, resonating in her chest. Adanna rose to her feet, clutching the talisman tightly. The sound wasn't coming from the village or the forest. It was coming from the graves. She approached the nearest headstone, her heart pounding. The drumbeat seemed to vibrate through the ground, rhythmic and relentless. Suddenly, the soil began to stir, as though something beneath was trying to claw its way out. Adanna stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. This was no ordinary spirit. This was something ancient, something primal. The drumming ceased abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Then, a voice echoed through the burial grounds. It was deep and guttural, speaking in a language Adanna didn't understand. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with power. She felt a sudden surge of heat, and the talisman in her hand burned brightly, its glow piercing the darkness. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but resolute. The voice didn't answer, but the ground beneath her feet shifted again. A crack appeared in the earth, and from it emerged a faint, ghostly figure. It was humanoid but indistinct, its features obscured by a swirling mist. Adanna stepped back, her grip on the talisman tightening. The figure raised a hand, and the air around her grew heavy. Adanna felt an invisible force pressing against her, threatening to drive her to her knees. But she stood her ground, her eyes locked on the apparition. "What do you want?" she demanded. The figure's voice resonated in her mind rather than her ears. "The seal, broken." The apparition's words echoed in Adanna's mind, chilling her to the core. "The seal? Broken?" Her grip on the talisman tightened as she tried to steady her breathing. The figure hovered before her, its mist-like form undulating as though caught in an unseen current. The weight of its presence pressed heavily on her chest, but she forced herself to speak. "What seal?" she asked, her voice trembling but resolute. "What has been broken?" The ghostly figure tilted its head, its hollow gaze fixing on her. For a moment it said nothing, and then, in a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself, it replied, "The barrier that binds the forgotten, undone." Adanna's mind raced. She had heard whispers of ancient tales, stories passed down through generations about a time before the village, before the burial grounds. The elders spoke of a great evil that had been sealed away, its name long lost to time. Could this be what the figure meant? And if so, what had Adanna and the others unleashed with their reckless intrusion? The figure's presence seemed to dim slightly, as though its energy were waning. "Protect the living," it intoned, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Restore the seal before the shadow rises." Adanna stepped forward, her fear momentarily overtaken by urgency. "How?" she demanded. "How do I restore it?" The figure's form shuddered, and its voice grew faint. "Seek the relic beneath the roots." And with that, the apparition dissolved into the night, leaving Adanna alone in the suffocating darkness. Adanna's knees gave way, and she sank to the ground, her mind reeling. Beneath the roots, the burial grounds were surrounded by ancient trees, their gnarled roots twisting deep into the earth. She had no idea where to begin, but she knew she couldn't waste time. If the seal was truly broken, the entire village could be in danger. She spent the rest of the night gathering supplies: a sturdy lantern, a digging tool, and a small satchel to carry the talisman and anything else she might find. As dawn broke, casting its pale light over the burial grounds, Adanna stood at the edge of the forest, ready to begin her search. Her first stop was the oldest tree she knew of, a massive baobab that stood like a sentinel at the heart of the burial grounds. Its roots were thick and tangled, disappearing into the soil like the fingers of a giant hand. Adanna knelt at its base, her fingers brushing against the rough bark. The talisman in her satchel began to hum faintly, its glow seeping through the fabric. "This is it," she murmured, setting to work. She dug carefully but quickly, the soil soft and damp beneath her hands. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, but Adanna's determination didn't waver. Finally, her digging tool struck something hard. She cleared the dirt away, revealing a small, intricately carved box. Its surface was adorned with symbols she didn't recognize, but the talisman in her satchel began to glow brighter, as if in recognition. With trembling hands, she lifted the box from the ground and opened it. Inside was a shard of obsidian, its surface smooth and cold to the touch. As she held it, a surge of energy coursed through her, and the symbols on the box began to glow faintly. She didn't know how she knew, but she was certain this was the relic the spirit had spoken of. A low rumble echoed through the burial grounds, and Adanna looked up to see dark clouds gathering in the sky. The air grew heavy, and the hum of the talisman turned into a steady pulse. She had the relic, but she didn't know how to use it. The figure's warning rang in her ears: "Restore the seal before the shadow rises." Adanna rose to her feet, clutching the relic tightly. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: she was running out of time. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe and like the video as part is being prepared for you. Thanks.